Thank you, Hannah and Laura. They always do a great job of leading us when Mark is not with us. Mark is out of town. They're with grandkids, taking a much deserved vacation, having a good time together. Today, you'll also, I don't know if you noticed, since Andrew's usually up in the sound booth and you can't see him anyway, but Andrew's not here either. Andrew had already planned to be out, but then he got a huge gash in his arm and spent yesterday in the ER. So you need to be in prayer for him, be in prayer for them, pray that God brings them back. And also just kind of look around. If you see somebody that you normally see and they're not here, give them a call and just check in on them and just invite them to come back. Some of the most comforting words about Jesus, at least for our circumstances, for the things that we deal with, actually come from Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 15. You don't have to turn there, but you might want to make note of this. In Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 15, it's a passage, again, that's familiar. It says there, "For we do not have a high priest," and it's talking about Jesus, "who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in all things as we are, yet without sin." It's not that he can't sympathize with our weaknesses. He has been where we have been. He's hurt just like you've hurt. He's been through the things that you've been through. He's been betrayed just like you've been betrayed. He's dealt with stuff just like you and I have. And so when you go to him, his first answer to you is, "I get it. I hear you. I feel you," is what he would be saying. Those are comforting words coming from someone like God. He knows what we're going through, and he wants to walk with us through those things. I want to talk to you today about an extraordinary faith for life's adversity. And if you want to turn to a Bible verse, and I hope that you do, a Bible passage, I want you to turn over to Genesis chapter 37. We kind of introduced ourselves to the story of Joseph, and I want to look at that a little bit more in depth and talk about this extraordinary faith for life's adversities. Now, before I do that, I've got something that I want to do. I need to apologize for those of you who are watching online, because I'm going to step off screen here for just a second, because I really need to do that for just a moment. Timothy Martin, how you doing, man? I'm glad you're here today. I told you I was going to have a little bit of fun at your expense. So, you have a debit card? You have it on you? Can I have your debit card for a second? You're okay? Mikey, I'm not going to get you. There's not much on it? Okay, yes. All right. I appreciate that. Okay. So I've got Timothy's debit card. Now, Timothy, I just want you to know, I just want to bring to your attention that probably nobody has given me a harder time at this church in the last 5.5 years than you have. So I appreciate the debit card. I appreciate that. So let's see. Tommy and Gail. Now, y'all don't know Tommy and Gail all that well yet, but they've been so active in our church over the last, 2 months or so. You got a debit card? He's already reaching for his debit card. He's probably never coming back to the church after this. But anyway, let me see. So we've never met before this. I mean, before maybe 6 weeks ago, right? Something like that. 2 months maybe. Can't remember how long y'all been coming. Something like that. So he does not even know me. So that's awesome. So John Carr, John, you got your debit card? You got a credit? Okay, credit card will be fine. That'll be okay. So, but now John's a big time realtor here in Savannah. Business has been good lately, right? Yeah, it's been good lately. All right. So, anyway, so for those of you who are watching online, I got 3 cards right here. All right, so y'all were concerned about some of the finances here at the church. Concern no more, okay? I want to talk to you about faith, extraordinary faith, through life's adversities. And the reason I want to talk to you about this is because last week we talked about extraordinary faith that came from an ordinary man. Joseph went through some strange things. He went through some big things, but he himself, Joseph, was just a normal guy going through stuff. And he lived an extraordinary life. And the reason I bring that up again is because for those of you who weren't here last week, I want to remind you that you may feel like you're just an ordinary person. You know, you have your struggles and you have some successes and it's up and down for you, but you don't feel like maybe there's anything that's that great about you, especially compared to what you find about people in the Bible. I mean, those guys, they were like in a whole nother sphere. And so when you talk about faith and you talk about walking with God and trusting God in those things, that's okay for the people in the Bible because of who they were. But you don't understand who I am. That's good for them, but I'm just a little old me. And that's the beautiful thing about what we have in the Bible. Because we have a misconception about most of the guys and gals that we find in here. We think that they were in some other sphere, that they had they were attaining to something that we could never get to. But what we find is these are just ordinary people. And they had some extraordinary things happen in their lives, but you might too. And this faith that we talk about, this Bible that we refer to, and the things that we encourage you in, it works for you, just like it worked for them. It works for me, just like it worked for them. I'm an ordinary guy. You're an ordinary guy. We can have an extraordinary faith for life's adversities. Now, we looked at Joseph. We kind of did an overview of his story. We read through the first 4 verses last week, and so we're going to kind of pick up in Genesis chapter 37 and in verse 5. And I want to just, using his story, I want to talk about where adversity comes from. Now, I can't give you an exhaustive list. There's a bazillion different places where adversity could come from. And so you may be thinking of something that has happened in your life, and it may not be exactly the same as here, but there are 5 different things that happened in Joseph's life just in Genesis chapter 37 that probably would have some relation to the adversity that you and I face. And so there are several different places that adversity comes from. The first place that it comes from, that we find here at least in his life, in Genesis 37, begins in verse 5, and that is adversity came from shattered dreams. Shattered dreams. It says in verse 5, then Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, mistake number 1, when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. Now, if you weren't here last week, you maybe missed out on the introduction to this thing, and his brothers already had a lot against him. He was the favored one. He was the one that his dad loved him more than he loved the rest of them. And so they already had this animosity toward him, and then he tells them this dream, and they hate him even worse. Now, what would produce that? Well, the Bible tells us why that is, and maybe you would be able to relate to that. If you were one of the brothers, if I was one of the brothers, we would probably feel the same way. He said to them, please listen to this dream which I have had, for behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf rose up and also stood erect, and behold, your sheaves gathered around and bowed down to my sheaf. Isn't that cool? No, it's not. Then his brothers said to him, are you actually going to reign over us? Or are you really going to rule over us? Yeah, right. So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Now he had still another dream. And did what? And related it to his brothers. Now I'm like, Joseph, dude, can you not read the room? Okay? They don't like you to begin with. You had to open up your mouth about the first one. Can you at least be quiet for the second one? No. He just had to get this one out too. He has another dream, takes it to his brothers and said, lo, I've had still another dream. And behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars were bowing down to me. He related it to his father and even his dad. Even his dad kind of got sick of it. He related it to his father and his brothers, and his fathers rebuked him and said to him, what is this dream that you've had? Shall I and your mother and your brothers actually come to bow ourselves down before you to the ground? His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind. Now we know the rest of the story. We told it last week, and if you don't, basically it's going to take a whole lot bigger turn than what Joseph ever realized was going to happen before these things happened in his life. He's going to go through some difficulties that are going to look like his dream will never happen. And one of the first things that shatters us, one of the first things that brings adversity with us are shattered dreams. You know I like sports, right? I'm a sports guy. I follow sports, follow just about all of them in some form or fashion. I did some looking at some statistics, and it's interesting what you find there. You look at the sport of baseball. In one particular year in baseball, there were 482,629 baseball players who played in high school. Only 6.9% of them ever played in college. Just 6.9% of them. And out of that 6.9% that played in college, only 8.6% of those were drafted pro. Now, you can't tell me that out of 482,000 baseball players that there were only just a handful of them that dreamed of playing in the pros. They dreamed for it. They worked for it. They called all the coaches. They went to all the lessons. And they tried. But they did not make it. You look at football. You got the same story in football. In football, in the same particular year, there were 1,093,234 players in high school football. That year, only 6.6% of them played in college. And out of that 6.6% who played in college, only 1.6% of those were drafted pro. All of those guys out there, they just have these dreams of going to play for their favorite pro team and making the winning touchdown in the last second. Soccer. 417,419 soccer players in high school. 5.7% of them play in college. Only 1.4% of them drafted pro. And then, of course, basketball. You can't have but 5 on the court at a time. It takes a lot to be able to make it in basketball. There were 541,054 high school basketball players. Only 3.4% of those played in college. And of those 3.4% who played in college, only 1.2% were drafted as a professional basketball player. They worked hard. They had these dreams. And listen, we live in a culture that is shouting lies every single day. And they do so to make everybody feel good and to give everybody these warm fuzzies and all that kind of stuff. Well, if you just dream it and you just work toward those dreams, you'll realize those dreams. We hear that all the time. And it's simply not true. It doesn't mean that dreaming is wrong. It doesn't mean that we don't work hard for those dreams. But what happens when you have such a small, select group of people who ever make it to that dream, and they look back and they've been told all of their life, if you'll just dream it and you'll just work hard enough, you'll make it, and yet they dreamed and they worked their behinds off and they didn't make it. What do you do with those people? We're feeding people a bill of goods that's just not true. No, you dream and you work, and if that doesn't work out, you dream something else, and you work toward that, and you keep dreaming, and you keep working until the day that you die, until you find what God wants for you. And when you find what God wants for you, it says there that he who began a good work in me, he who put it in my heart, and he who put it in my mind, he will bring it to completion. And there you find joy. Joy unmatched in any professional sport, in any amount of money that you can make. The joy comes from the Lord. But you see, a lot of folks face adversity because of shattered dreams. Well, the story goes on. Here he goes to look for his brothers. His dad sends him to look for his brothers there in Genesis chapter 37. And so he goes on this journey to find his brothers. He takes a few turns. He goes to a few wrong places. They couldn't call each other up on the cell phone. They didn't have Life 360 to be able to find each other. No, he had to go searching, and he finally found his brothers. And in verse 18 of Genesis chapter 37, it says, when his brothers saw him from a distance, and before he came close to them, they plotted against him to put him to death. The second place that adversity comes from, that we learn from Joseph, and I almost hesitate to say it, but it is true, and that is victimization. Victimization. He was victimized. He was targeted. I hesitate to say that in our culture because nowadays everybody acts like they're a victim, you know. And if you don't think you're a victim, just talk with somebody and they'll tell you how you should think that you're a victim. I remember, gosh, it was probably, it may have been 25 years ago. I read an article by James Dobson, and the title said it all. It said, "The victimization of everyone." Everyone is victimized nowadays. And that's not really true. We're not really victims the way that we think we are. But there are some people who are targeted. That's true. And Joseph was one of those. They looked at him and they wanted specifically to do him harm. I remember a movie I saw about 7-8 years ago about Louis Zamperini. Maybe you saw it too. It's the movie is called Unbroken. Came out in 2014. There are actually 2 sequels to that movie, two movies that were based on his life story. There was Unbroken, but then the 2 following, there was Unbroken, The Path to Redemption, and then also Captured by Grace. He was in World War II. He was captive in World War II, and there was a Japanese corporal that found out that he was trying out for the Olympics and specifically targeted him and wanted to bring him down and to hurt him and to harm him, and through him to harm everybody that was also captive with him. And maybe you have felt targeted. Maybe there has been somebody at work who tried to get you fired. Maybe there has been somebody in your neighborhood that wanted you out. Maybe you were in a circle of friends and somebody began to give rumors because maybe they were jealous of you and they were starting to spread rumors about you so that nobody would like you. Maybe you have been targeted and you have been victimized, and oftentimes adversity comes through victimization. We go through it, it's crazy what happens. Verse 19 of Genesis 37, I hope you still have your Bibles open, just keep them open the rest of the time. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Now then come and let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. And we will say, a wild beast devoured him, then let us see what will become of his dreams." They were specifically wanting to shatter those dreams. But Reuben, he was the firstborn, he was the one responsible for everybody. He heard this and rescued him out of their hands and said, "Let us not take his life." Reuben further said to them, "Shed no blood, throw him into this pit that is in the wilderness, but do not lay hands on him, that he might rescue him out of their hands to restore him to his father." So it came about, if it wasn't so tragic, it would be funny. So it came about when Joseph reached his brothers, they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the very colored tunic that was on him. Then they took him and threw him into the pit. Now the pit was empty without any water in it. I guess that's not the funny part. Hold on just a second. I'll tell you where that is. But another source of our adversity is broken relationships. Broken relationships. When they stripped him of his tunic, that represents the separation by choice, the separation by death. It really was symbolic of more than just taking clothes that had been given. We're going to strip him of everything having to do with our family. Have you ever felt ostracized by people that you loved, people that you trusted? They didn't like what you did. They didn't like a decision that you made. They didn't think you were worthy. You didn't measure up to their standards, and so you were kind of cast off to the side. Maybe somebody just chose to go in a different direction, to leave and to go be friends with someone else or even be married with someone else. Broken relationships bring adversity. Not only that, but the callousness and sinfulness in the world brings adversity. Then they sat down to eat a meal. And as they raised their eyes and looked, behold, a caravan of Ishmaelites was coming from Gilead with their camels bearing aromatic gum and balm and myrrh on their way to bring them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, and I guess this is the part that I find humorous because it's just so crazy. "What profit is it for us to kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come and let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." Hey, we got standards here. He's our brother. We can't kill him. Let's just sell him. And the fact that in verse 25, They knew what they were getting ready to do, but they just sat down to eat a meal like it was no big deal. People are just callous. They're just callous. They just don't care. Listen, the same thing happens over in the story of Esther. You ever read the book of Esther? It's not a long read. It's an interesting read. It is such great turn of events. It ought to be a movie. Probably somebody's made it a movie, but it probably wasn't any good. Somebody needs to make a good movie out of the book of Esther. And there's this guy named Haman in the book of Esther, and Haman's the bad guy. And his desire is to exterminate the Jews. Now, you think Hitler began that thing. Nope, this has been something that's been going on all of history, to totally wipe out the Jewish people. Anti-Semitism is a real deal, and it's sad. And Haman is one of those guys. He wants to get rid of all the Jews, and he comes up with a perfect plot, gets the king in on it, and everything. And he's got all the details worked out. And he sends this word out all over town that everything gets in a big old upheaval, and all this kind of confusion that's going on, all this craziness that's going on. The next day, all these people are going to be slaughtered just because they are called Jew. And what does Haman do? He sits down to have a drink. Same thing. I read a few years ago, and there are like a bazillion instances. I just can't find one as heinous, I don't think. But I read a few years ago that on Panama City Beach, there was a gang rape that took place. Now, that's probably nothing unusual, honestly, Panama City Beach. But this was on the beach in the middle of the day with thousands of people around. And not only did nobody do anything about it, people videoed it with their phones. That's the world we live in. It's kind of like, and it's been going on. Jesus taught, I think we referenced this a few weeks ago. Jesus told the story of the Good Samaritan, and there was somebody who was all laid out and messed up and just in bad shape. And the two religious people in the story, they look, they see what's going on. And not only did they not do anything, they cross the other side of the road to get as far away as they can and just ignore what they saw. And sometimes when you think about the callousness and the sinfulness that we have in this world, we find that adversity comes from that kind of thing. And then the last thing that we see, at least in this chapter, that brings adversity, and it could bring adversity in your life, is loneliness. Loneliness. They say, hey, let's throw him into this pit. Let's just sell him off. And then, so they do, they sell him off. He gets carted down to Egypt. And look at verse 36. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, Pharaoh's officer, the captain of the bodyguard. He just gets getting pawned off. Sold. One place to another. There's nothing personal about him. He's just a piece of property. Let's just move him around at our own convenience. I remember when my kids introducing them to the Social Security card and a Social Security number, and telling them, hey, you're going to have to memorize this one day. And you know why you got to memorize that? Because that's who you are. That is what you are to the government. You're not Paul Brunson. You're a Social Security number. What is that number, by the way? I'm just kidding. You don't have to tell me that. We're just a number. And he just passed around. And there's just this sense of loneliness where you are all by yourself, like Joseph was. Adversity. Now, here's the thing. When adversity spreads you thin, your faith must grow thick. When adversity spreads you thin, your faith must grow thick. I want you to turn to the end of the story because, and we'll look at this in more context later on, but in Genesis chapter 50, it's the last It's the last chapter. The anchor of the entire story. The anchor of his faith. Genesis chapter 50 and in verse 20. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. The same way that these people had intentionally put Joseph through the ringer, God was just as intentional, but his was for good. That's the anchor of everything in Joseph's life. When you talk about being ordinary, but you want an extraordinary faith to deal with life's adversities, there you go. God meant it for good. Now, you think about, just like what you know of his story, which some of you may only know what I talked about last week, or if you didn't hear last week, you may not know anything about his story, but some of you know the story quite well. How did Joseph just happen to end up in Pharaoh's court? How did Pharaoh just happen to have a dream? And how did his cupbearer just happen to know about Pharaoh's dream? And how did the cupbearer just happen to have his own dream a couple of years earlier that Joseph was able to interpret for him? And how did Joseph just happen to be in the same jail as the cupbearer? And how did Joseph happen to be in Potiphar's house so that the wife could blame him for something he did not do to throw him in jail with the cupbearer? And how did he end up in Potiphar's house? By the Midianites. And how did the Midianites end up with him? From his brothers. And how did his brothers end up with him? Listen, back in Genesis chapter 37, here's a curve I didn't throw at you until now. In verse 15, well, actually, in verse 17, he ends up in Dothan, not Alabama, Dothan, which was the closest trade route to Egypt. Did he just happen to be there? And here's even more remarkable than that. How did he end up in Dothan? In verse 15, he's wandering around, and listen to what it says. A man found him. How did he just end up in the same field as a man who knew that they were in Dothan and took him to Dothan, which was close to Egypt, so that they could sell him to the Midianites, who would take him down to Egypt, sell him to Potiphar. Potiphar's wife did what she did. He ends up in jail with the cupbearer's dream, interprets that dream. Cupbearer ends up in Pharaoh. Pharaoh has a dream. He ends up in Pharaoh. How did all that happen? Just by coincidence? No. God meant it for good. It's a God thing. But now here's the thing for you. Here's the thing. And because I know we still have a hard time putting ourselves on the same plane as a guy like Joseph, even though he's just ordinary. Do you think that day after day, as he is sitting in that jail, do you think that while he is looking up his brothers from this pit, and he's remembering this dream that he's had, and he's wondering why he said anything in the first place, but he's looking up, he's like, this ain't how this dream was supposed to go down? Do you think that he saw God at every step of the process? Listen, you see God when you look back. It's a whole lot harder to see God when you're in the pit. But he recognizes that God did it for good. He meant it for good. You see, faith is not a feeling. Faith is not mystical. Faith is not education. Faith isn't even experience. You want to know what faith is? This is faith. I I told Timothy, man, you have messed with me since I've been here. I can get you back. I told Tommy, we just met. He gave me his debit card. John, now John knows me, but maybe John has a lot to lose. That's what Bruce said. He gave it to me anyway. It's not because they know it. They had no clue what I was going to do with these. But they gave them over to me. This is faith. You don't have to know the whole Bible. You don't. You don't have to see how it's going to work out. You don't have to know what God's going to do. You just say, God, if you ask for it, it's yours. That is extraordinary faith through the adversity that you face. So the question is will you give it to him? Let me tell you something. He's earned it. He's earned it. I mean, that might be something that John is saying. John and I we're friends. And he's done a lot for me. And Timothy, as hard of a time as he gives me, he probably knows I'm not going to come out here and steal money, at least not in front of y'all, I'm not. He just said, okay, God has earned your trust. So now take whatever it is that you're facing. Take whatever it is you're facing. I don't know what the adversity is. I'm not preaching this with anybody in mind. Not a single person came to mind. Whatever it is that you're facing, just say, God, I don't like this. Here it is. Take it. Do with it whatever you want. Hands off. Because at the end of the story, I simply want to be able to say, God meant this for good. Now, it begins with a personal relationship with him. That's where it really starts, is when you trust your soul, you trust your eternity to him. And say, God, take me. Take my life. Take my sin. Take my guilt. You died on the cross for me. Forgive me, God, and take control of my life. When you begin with that relationship with him, the rest of this stuff will begin to take shape. It begins with a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. Do you know him? Have you ever been saved? Have you ever called out to him, asking him to be Savior and Lord? If you've never done that, do that today. Do that right where you're sitting. If you got questions about what that means, and again, you don't have to have my help to do that, but if you want my help, I want to do that. I want to help. And so you can take the response card that's in front of you. It's a QR code. It's also going to be on the screen. It's a little bit different than the first one that we did, but that'll begin a conversation. And we can talk about that. It'll come straight to me, and we can talk about what it means to give your heart and life to Jesus. If you've never done that, do that today. And if you have, if you've entrusted him with your eternal soul, begin to entrust him with the situations that you face on the regular. If you need help with those, if you need help with your faith and you're struggling through something right now, that's one of the reasons that we have prayer partners. We're going to have prayer partners right over here. Y'all, okay, yes. It's Glenn and Liz today, and they're going to be right over here next to this stained glass window right up here in the front. Just come to them and just say, listen, will you pray with me? Will you pray for me? That's why we do that, because we want to help build up one another in our faith. And so take advantage of that. You don't even have to know them. You don't have to know their name. You don't have to tell your story, any of that kind of stuff. Just go over there, and they're there to pray with you and to pray for you. That's what we want to do, because we're church family. God, we thank you that you walk with us. We thank you that you're a trustworthy God. And I pray that you'd enlarge our faith and that you'd teach us how to trust you with the things that we face. We thank you for recording the story of Joseph, just a regular guy who went through some crazy, crazy things. And in this case, he displayed an extraordinary faith. And I pray that we would be able to exercise that as well. In Jesus' name, amen.
We close our service today with the hymn, Leaning on the Everlasting Arms. Please stand and sing with us.
What a fellowship, what a joy divine, leaning on the everlasting arms. What a blessedness, what secure from all alarms, leaning, leaning, leaning on the everlasting arms. What have I to dread? What have I to fear? Leaning on the everlasting arms, I have blessed peace with my Lord so near. Leaning on the everlasting arms, leaning, leaning, safe and secure from all alarms, leaning, leaning, leaning on the everlasting arms.
You are dismissed.